Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, and if you're new, welcome. My name is Adelina and I make videos about living in my tiny house on wheels and living a more intentional life. Sophie's obviously going to lay on my laptop where I have my notes, so I'm going to have to move this. Okay, I think I have it all sorted out. All right, so today I wanted to talk about tiny houses versus RVs, campers, fifth wheels. I'm just going to lump all of that into the term RV for recreational vehicle. I still get a lot of questions about why didn't I just buy an RV? It would have been cheaper and easier. I could buy one used, that sort of thing. Why wouldn't I just buy an RV versus building a tiny house on wheels? And that is a really good question. And I just want to start the video by saying that I actually have nothing against RVs, campers, fifth wheels, trailers, any of that. I think that they are great, and I think that they serve a very specific purpose. So I don't have a bias. I think it really depends on your personal preference. What is it that you want? And everybody has different needs. It really depends on your lifestyle and your future needs. Are you going to live in it full time, or is this something that's going to be part-time? Are you going to move around a lot, or are you going to mostly be stationary? Are you pulling it yourself, or are you having somebody else pull it? Are you building it yourself, or are you having it professionally built or built by somebody else? So as with everything else in life, the answer to the question about whether a tiny house is better than an RV is it depends, because it really does depend on you as the person who's making the decision and who's going to be living in this home. So I don't think there's a clear-cut winner or loser in this. It's just there are pros and cons to each, and I'm just going to go over those today. I'm going to start with the appearance. We're going to start with the look, the appearance on the outside. An RV will always look like an RV. It's just the way it's built. It doesn't matter whether you're going with a new one or an old one, whether it's a fifth wheel, a trailer, or a motorhome, or an Airstream, which is really cool. It'll always look like a recreational vehicle. There's no way around that. Tiny house, on the other hand, looks like a house. It's just miniature. You can build it in any style you want. It looks so much more like your standard foundation built house. And for a lot of people, that makes a big difference in how they feel about their home. For me, it definitely did. I wanted to live in a house that just happened to be super small. If you want your home to look more like a traditional house and to be able to build that character into it from the outside, then a tiny house is definitely going to give you that ability to do that. So the inside of an RV is also a lot different than the inside of a tiny house. When you are inside of a tiny house on wheels, it feels like a regular house, a regular foundation built house. I've yet to walk into an RV and not have it very obvious that I was in an RV. And I've yet to walk into a tiny house that I didn't feel was cozy, homey, just very, very welcoming and comfortable. Not that an RV can't be, but in general, the inside of a tiny house is just like the inside of your foundation built house. It just happens to be on wheels and smaller. When you're buying an RV, let's say you're buying a new one, you will have some options for floor layouts, bed layouts, and things like that. They will give you some options for floor plans if you're ordering one brand new. Building a tiny house, whether you're building it yourself or you're having a builder build it, you get to customize everything. You get to decide how many windows you're going to have, where your bedroom's going to be, the layout of your kitchen. Everything is customizable. So therefore, the house is built exactly for your lifestyle now and in the future. That to me is a real plus for a tiny house, is the fact that you get to design your tiny house to uniquely fit your needs, your budget, your future plans. You get to choose everything in there. Like I say, you get to choose the number of windows that you have, the number of doors that you have, where your bedroom's going to be, the quality of your fixtures, the quality of your appliances, all of those things you get to choose based on, like I say, your lifestyle and your budget. With an RV, you are always fitting into their design. You're lucky if you can find one that's as close to what you need as possible. But in general, you're still trying to fit yourself into their design versus building your design to fit you. So I've got to say that that's one of the things I really like about living in a tiny house on wheels. And one of the reasons I chose a tiny house versus an RV is the fact that it would give me the same look and the same feel as living in a regular house, just while still giving me the freedom to live the lifestyle that I wanted to live and to move it when I want to move it. Also, the materials that are used to build them are very different. Just by nature, an RV is meant to be moved regularly, and therefore they are built to be light. And that's really the number one factor that is considered when they're building an RV. A tiny house, they're built very differently than an RV because they're built more like a foundation built house. I have seen some tiny houses that are built with metal studs, but in general, they're usually built with wood framing, and therefore they're heavier. Some of the materials that are used to build RVs can off-gas a lot and can be toxic or cause issues for people who are very sensitive to chemicals and things like that. I know formaldehyde is used when they're in the construction of particle board, and a lot of particle board is used in RVs because it's light, a lot lighter than wood. And so obviously formaldehyde can off gas. That can be very toxic, especially for people who are very sensitive. Now, it might not bother you. You might prefer something light and easy to move. Like my house has 2x4 walls. It's got wood tongue and groove paneling on the walls and on the roof. She's heavier because of that. To me, that wasn't a negative because I'm not planning to move my house that often. But if I was planning to tour around with my tiny house, then that might be an issue because there would be a lot more weight to deal with. I have seen lots of tiny houses where the owners move them regularly, in fact travel with them, and it's not an issue for them. They either have a vehicle that can handle it or they build a much smaller tiny house than I have. But when they're building RVs, they're always thinking about how to keep these things as light as possible, so because they're going to be moved regularly. So you're going to get a lot of particle boards, you're going to get a lot of plastics of some type. And because they're not as strong, they're more likely to fail sooner than something that's built with solid wood or something heavier or more heavy duty. So I think it's definitely important to think about the construction of both types of homes and decide what's best for you. My priority was not how light is it, how easy is it to move. My priority was to have a house that felt like my foundation built house, just on a custom built trailer. Now, there's no doubt that pulling a tiny house on wheels is different than pulling an RV. I have a fifth wheel style, a gooseneck style. I guess they're different. I always interchange those two terms, but the mover I was talking to says they're different, but you know what I mean by a gooseneck style trailer. If I were to compare pulling this to moving a RV that was a fifth wheel, it would be very different. RVs, because of the outsides being so different than a tiny house, are built to be aerodynamic. Again, they're built to be light and easy to move. So when you're pulling one of those, I would suspect, I've never done it, but I would suspect it feels very different than when you're pulling a tiny house on wheels of the same length, because this is so much heavier. That is a consideration, right? Because if you're going to be moving your tiny house regularly, it's going to be a lot more cost efficient, a lot easier on gas to move an RV than it is to move a tiny house on wheels. They're both going to be very expensive, especially with the price of gas right now. It's going to be easier and less expensive to move an RV than it is a tiny house because they are built, RVs are built to be aerodynamic and easy to move versus a tiny house. I mean, I guess you could build your tiny house to be more aerodynamic, but I think in general, they don't tend to be very aerodynamic on the road. That can definitely sway your decision if what you plan to do is move regularly. One of the things that I have talked about a fair amount on this channel is about how the tiny house is done in the cold Alberta winters that we have here. And I have to say, that was one of the considerations that I had in my mind when I decided to build a tiny house versus buying an RV. I wanted something that was warm, that could handle our winters, and they can be very cold. I mean, getting down to minus 35, minus 40 degrees Celsius at night in the middle of winter, that's cold. And then you add the wind chill to that. And so I needed a structure. I needed a home that could handle that kind of temperature. And I knew that I could build a tiny house that could, especially because I used a builder who lives in this climate and builds houses for this climate. So the tiny house has spray foam insulation on the roof, walls, and on the floor, under the floor. And that means that it's really well insulated. Now the furnace is an RV furnace. It's a Dometic RV furnace that you could get in an RV as well. But because the house is built with thicker walls and with spray foam insulation, because the windows that I've chosen for the tiny house, that you choose for a tiny house, are the same windows that you would choose for your foundation built house. They are energy efficient windows and built for these climates. Windows for an RV are built to be light so that they don't add a lot to the overall weight of the home, of the RV. RVs just aren't built for this kind of cold. I will say that you can buy an RV that is a 4-season RV that is better insulated. You won't be able to convince me that it can handle the cold the way that a tiny house does, that is framed, wood framed, and spray foam insulated, and with this type of windows. So this tiny house does really well in the winter. Even in the summer, it does really well in the heat. Now, I don't have a built-in air conditioner. I didn't put one in because my climate just doesn't get that hot for that long in the summer. But last year, when we had that really hot spell, I did buy a portable air conditioner that I put up in the loft, and that worked really well. If I was building for a climate where it was going to get that hot as well, I would have put in a built-in air conditioner. You can do that in your tiny house because you can build it exactly the way that you want it. A standard RV, especially a used RV that you're going to buy that's a few years old, is not going to be built to handle really cold climates because it's just not going to have the insulation that it needs because the walls, and it really can't, because the walls are a lot thinner in an RV than they are in a tiny house. I wanted something that could handle a cold Canadian winter, and this tiny house really has, so I'm really glad that I chose a tiny house for that reason. Now, there's no doubt that there's a cost difference between building a tiny house on wheels and buying an RV, especially a used RV. Even if you were going to buy a brand new RV. If you're buying a motorhome, then you're definitely going to be spending more than I spent to build this tiny house, and I had this tiny house professionally built. I've done a lot of research, and motorhomes are more expensive than a tiny house of this length. Now, if you're building your tiny house yourself, you're going to spend less money. There's no doubt about it. But I wanted a professional to build my tiny house. And so there's cost is always something that gets discussed in these types of discussions and forums. And yes, an RV, especially if you're buying a used one, can be less expensive. Even a brand new fifth wheel of this length is going to be less expensive than this. So if price is your number one deciding factor, and that is how you're going to make your decision, an RV is probably going to be the way to go. Earlier I said that when you're buying an RV, you have to basically fit into the design that options that they give you. I have seen people who have taken an RV, an Airstream or a different type of RV, and they have basically torn it down and rebuilt it all. And on the inside, it does look like a house. It's really cute, and it looks like a tiny house on the inside. But keep in mind, the trailer that these RVs are built on are built for the weight of the structure it came with. So when you are tearing one apart and rebuilding it, putting in hardwood floors, putting in real cabinetry versus particle board cabinetry, adding appliances, things like that, you're adding a lot of weight to that structure. So you want to be sure, if you're going to do that, that the trailer and the axles are sufficient, appropriate for the new weight of the structure that you're going to put on, because there's a big difference between framing something with 2x4 lumber and the type of framing that comes standard in an RV. If you're going to buy a used RV and you're going to tear it apart, or even just on the inside and rebuild it, that can be a real cost-efficient. Why can't I say that word? That can be a real cost-efficient strategy for getting a great little house on wheels. But you have to know what you're doing. You have to be sure that that trailer is sturdy enough. It may require reinforcing it so that it can handle the weight. It really is important to make sure the axles can handle the weight, because you're going to be pulling that sucker down the highway, and you really don't want that trailer to fail when you're pulling your renovated RV. But that can be a definite option. There are pluses and minuses on both sides. You know, with an RV, you're going to spend less money, especially if you're not buying brand new. You're going to have a home that's a lot lighter. It's going to be easier to move. It's going to be more aerodynamic, so less expensive to move. So those are all good things. If you are building a tiny house on wheels, you're going to get a house that looks like a house both inside and out, so you don't feel like you're living in a camper or your RV. You're going to have much more solid construction on the framing, and the cabinetries and fittings inside are also going to be more solid. You're going to have a house that can be insulated properly for really extreme heat and cold. I don't think that one is necessarily better than the other. They are very different. They tend to lend themselves to different lifestyles. I am not a nomad. I don't want to travel constantly. I do like to travel, and that's why I built the camper van, but I don't plan to travel in my tiny house. So for me, the priority was building something really solid, really safe, really well insulated, and that really felt like a home for me. I did not want it to look like a trailer. I wanted it to look like a house. I did not, on the outside, and I did not want it to feel like a trailer RV on the inside. I wanted it to have everything that my house did before I built it, just smaller. So for me, that was the priority, and I was willing to pay more in order to have that, because that was my priority. For somebody else, their priority could definitely be to have something that was really flexible, that they could move around a lot with, and that was easy to pull, and that was less expensive to build or renovate. Again, two very different priorities, and the nice thing is that there's something for everybody here. So those are my thoughts on that. I made a video on RVs versus tiny houses ages ago, and I wanted to revisit it because my thoughts had changed after seeing more RVs that had been renovated, and talking to people who were living in them and learning more about why they chose that lifestyle versus the tiny house lifestyle. I think there's a place for both, and one's not better than the other. They're just different. I just wanted to wish everyone a happy Easter, whether you celebrate Easter as a religious holiday or Easter bunny and chocolate egg type holiday. I just want to wish you all a happy holiday. I just got over having the flu. It was not the Rona, because Jamie was able to find me some rapid home tests, which, I mean, you had to sell a kidney for a while there to try and get one of those at-home kits. Luckily, there's 5 tests in there, so at least we have some in case one of us goes down with the flu at another time. But I was able to test. It wasn't that. It was just the flu. I just had a really bad headache, achy, all of those things. But it didn't last that long, and it wasn't really that bad. And so I feel really good today. I feel normal, which is awesome to be able to say. You don't appreciate your health until you feel really bad for a couple of days. And then you go, oh yeah, I feel good most of the time. So I hope you're healthy. I hope you're doing well. And remember, in a world where you can be anything, be kind. I love you guys, and I'll see you next week. For those of you wondering what Sophie's doing today while I'm filming, she's enjoying the sunshine. And now she's annoyed because I bugged her. Sophie. There's Sophie's pissed off face.